Thank you, Andrew. So thank you very much for the introduction, and indeed thank you to the Energy Simulation team for organising this summit. It's very much appreciated to have this opportunity to share some of the results from the CHAIR programme with you. So I'm going to be talking about the importance of compositional modelling for carbon capture, utilisation and storage simulations, and also for the simulation of hydrogen storage as part of the Energy Simulation Chair in CCUS and Reactive Flow Simulation at Heriot-Watt University. So as Harney did, I'm also going to give a little bit of an overview of the work that we've been doing. The chair covers research into reservoir engineering processes where chemical reactions, be they between pairs or even three fluids, or between fluids and rock, and geochemical reactions have a major bearing on the outcomes of the projects. So the types of challenge that we look to address is to use reactive transport modelling to better understand how subsurface gas storage processes work. For example, CO2 injection, or a topic of increasing importance now is hydrogen injection, and also looking at a long history of looking at management of mineral scaling in oil and gas production wells, but also looking at the potential of deposition in other types of system, including CO2 injection wells and potentially geothermal wells. And then accounting for chemical types of interactions that Arne has just been describing in chemical EUR processes. And I'd just like to thank Arne for his collaboration there in a couple of projects on that front. So today we want to talk about a couple of specific problems, and that is related to the energy transition, modelling gas storage, either for permanent storage, such as might be the case for CO2, or for temporary storage, as might be the case with hydrogen. And I want to mention some members of the energy simulation team associated with my chair at Heriot-Watt University. On the top right here, we've got Dr. Said Gambari, who is a postdoc working on CO2 storage primarily, and Dr. Gang Wang, both graduates of Heriot-Watt. Dr. Gang Wang, who holds a Leverhulme fellowship, and in fact I'll be sharing some of the results from his work with you. He's been concentrating mainly on hydrogen storage. And then we've got a group of PhD students who have completed their who are ongoing in the program. 3 have completed their studies. We have Hydra and Munther, and we've got Hassan down here, who in fact just passed his Viva yesterday. And so well done to them. It's good to see them progressing and moving on. So the background to this is that we need to, as Andrew introduced, we need to be increasingly looking at the energy transition and how to make energy production and distribution cleaner. And one component of that is CCUS, injecting CO2. And at Heriot-Watt, we're looking specifically at the injection of CO2 into saline aquifers and depleted oil and gas fields. And I'll mention one project here on saline aquifers. And then also looking at hydrogen injection into saline aquifers also, but here for temporary storage, so the hydrogen can be recovered. As Andrew mentioned, approximately, even by the most conservative estimates, a quarter of energy generation and production and generation by 2050 will still be based on hydrocarbons. And that's data taken from the BP Energy Outlook. Actually, the data is collected at Heriot-Watt University. It's not something that's widely known, but that BP Energy Outlook is based on research done by colleagues at Heriot-Watt University. Anyway, if we are still going to be producing so much hydrocarbon by 2050, how are we going to need to meet our net zero targets? And one facet of the approach for dealing with that is to consider hydrogen generation. So hydrogen as an energy vector being generated, maybe generated by electrolysis, but also it can be generated what's called blue hydrogen by steam methane reformation. Associated with that will be the need to store any produced hydrogen, but there's also a byproduct of carbon dioxide, which will also need to be in some way dealt with. And one question that is being addressed in this work by Gang Wang is whether CO2 can be used as a cushion gas. So we'll look at the implications of that. You may have noticed in Arne's presentation, in one of his early slides where he was giving an overview of his work, he described CO2 displacement in a quarter 5-spot system. And he identified that while you can track the gas phase as it's propagating through the reservoir, and obviously the CO2 is modeled as being a gas, although in fact it will probably be a dense phase fluid. The breakthrough of CO2 may in fact occur earlier than the gas phase breaks through at the production well. You may have spotted that in his slides, and he made reference to it. In order to be able to capture that effect, you have to be able to see the solubility of CO2 in the aqueous phase. So he was identifying that actually you need to track not just the phase displacement, but also the mole fraction of components within the phases, and the partitioning of, in this particular case, of CO2 into the aqueous phase. Now, it is possible to use black oil simulation to model CO2 injection in aquifers. So if you fix the temperature of the system, there are dead oil PVT tables that can be used where the aqueous phase is actually modeled as oil in the model, and then the CO2 is modeled as gas, and you can have tables that identify the solubility and the information volume factor and viscosity of the CO2 saturated brine for various pressures, and it is possible to do that using a black oil model. What it's not then possible to do using those models is to look at the partitioning of other components in the system, or indeed to look at the solubility of CO2 in an aqueous phase when there are also hydrocarbons present. So that's one instance where compositional simulation is required. Another one is to address a specific problem, which is that of halite deposition, salt deposition, which can take place in the near wellbore zone around CO2 injection wells, and that's due to the evaporation of the CO2, the evaporation of water into the CO2-rich gas phase, leaving a salt residue in the immobile and depleting water phase. And eventually, that salt may cause some impairment to permeability. We also get in a hydrogen storage scenario where using CO2 as a cushion gas, we may get dissolution, actually potentially of both, although it's predominantly of CO2 in the aqueous phase, and that can affect the transport and retention of the components. So we're going to look at the use of compositional modeling and try and understand a little bit better the partitioning of components in the various phases to study the integrity of the injection well under a halite scaling scenario for CO2 injection, and looking at the purity of the hydrogen working gas in aquifer storage scenario where CO2 is used as a cushion gas. So in both cases, our method is going to be to use a compositional simulation approach using GEM, and I want to thank CMG for not just for access to the software that they give to us for teaching and for our research purposes, but also for the strong support, for the willingness to engage with technical questions, indeed to make modifications to the codes, and also for the general interest and discussions that they have in the research that we're doing. And it's a fantastic boon for us now. I just want to mark that here and say a big thank you. So we'll be looking at modeling mineral components in the aqueous phase that can cause precipitation or dissolution reactions, and we might use an activity model such as PITSR to help us with that. And then looking at modeling the evaporation process, and that requires H2O to be included as a component in the equation of state. That evaporation of water from the aqueous phase into the hydrocarbon phases then allows for the increase in concentration of the remaining minerals in the aqueous phase until the aqueous phase becomes oversaturated and we start to get deposition. And that deposition will reduce the porosity directly, and then we can give an estimate of the impact on the permeability through a correlation such as the Kozeny-Kármán correlation, and there are other ones as well. And then it's also important, as I said, to model particularly the solubility of CO2, but also solubility of hydrogen in the aqueous phase, and typically would use a Henry's law correlation to do that. So in the first of these two little vignettes I want to share with you, we will be building a 2D, or we have built a 2D radial model to study CO2 injection into a moderately high salinity aquifer, salinity of 250,000 ppm. Now I should say that this work, so I'm going to be presenting some work. It's an extension of some work that was done with former PhD Ayrton Ribeiro, who's now at the University of Queensland, and in collaboration with Leonardo Guimarães in UFPE. So thank you to them for sharing in this work. During this process, the CO2, injected CO2 displaces the mobile formation water in a kind of Buckley-Leverett type displacement process away from the injection well. That will then leave a residual water phase, but if we allow for the evaporation of that water into the dry CO2 stream that is continuously being injected, then that will create a dry out zone around the injection well, and it's in this dry out zone that the salt deposition will take place and reduce the porosity, and thereby reduce the permeability and affect the injectivity and therefore the integrity of the injection well. So here's a couple of pictures. We have the so this is a 2D vertical cross section of the radial model. We have the CO2 injection well, the completions down here. We're modeling out to something like 1 kilometer away from the injection well, and with the CO2 being displaced, we're looking at the mass of halite that is depositing away from the well. You can see parts, so this is after 2,000 days on the left and after 5,000 days on the right, and you can see an increasing mass depositing as we go further out. Don't be fooled by that. That is a consequence of the radial model, and we actually have larger volume grid blocks, so we expect a higher mass. But if we move on, and if we look at the porosity, and here, in fact, the permeability change that is caused by the deposition of halite, we can actually see that the biggest changes in permeability occur. Some of them occur actually quite close to the injection well perforations in that zone round the well, at the boundary between the water in the aquifer. So you can see that the CO2 here has risen towards the top of the system due to gravity, and so we have this boundary between the aquifer water and the CO2 that's been injected. And it's in this zone here that we get an almost 50% reduction in the permeability from something around 260 millidarcies to below, in fact, below 130 millidarcies down here. So quite a significant reduction in the permeability due to the precipitation. Now we need to remember that with the evaporation of the water taking place, the gas or the CO2 saturation, supercritical CO2 saturation, is actually increasing. So more of the pore space, as the water evaporates, more of the pore space can be occupied by gas, but it's also resulting in a deposition of a solid, and that solid may cause blockage especially in the narrower pore throats, thereby reducing the permeability there. There's a data gap here. We need to have more data on the extent to which the permeability is reduced by the salt precipitation, but using a fairly simple assumption here, we're seeing an almost 50% decrease in the permeability. Part of this is caused by, so why is this happening at the leading edge of the CO2 front and close to the well? Well, in this zone here, we've actually got CO2 and it's flowing up the way. In the dry out zone, this is a water wet system and we have capillarity. There'll be some imbibition of the formation water back into this zone, and so there'll be a supply of high salinity brine coming into this zone, evaporating into the CO2 stream and being carried away and leaving the salt behind. And so it's not just the initial water that was in that volume of rock that's causing the deposition, but in fact there will be additional deposition because of the additional saline water flowing into that zone. So in a system such as this with a salinity of 250,000 ppm, we can see a reduction in the permeability. I haven't presented the results here, but we did some work that showed that the problem can be addressed in two ways, either by allowing the salt deposit to form and then injecting slugs of fresh water. The halite is very soluble, of course, and so those can be used to clean it out from the near wellbore zone. Or in fact, it can be prevented by performing a pre-flush of fresh water, which displaces the formation water, the salty formation water, away from the well before the CO2 is injected. And if deposition happens deeper into the reservoir, that's not going to cause any significant impact on injectivity. However, caution will always be needed in terms of the potential for re-imbibition of formation water into the dry out zone, especially if the flow rate should happen to vary. So in the second bit of modeling, this is the work that's carried out by Gang Wang. We have a 2D Cartesian model looking at hydrogen injection, but the hydrogen is being preceded by CO2 as a cushion gas. So it's injecting into an aquifer again. The CO2 will displace the mobile formation water, and then that will be followed by the hydrogen, which displaces the CO2. We'd anticipate some mixing between the hydrogen and the CO2, and we want to look at the impact of this mixing on the purity of the produced hydrogen. But we need to be aware that there may be contaminants in that produced hydrogen, those contaminants being the water in the system, of course, and the CO2 that was injected beforehand. And we want to know what is the impact of the solubility of the CO2 on this. Now, just get your eye on a few comparisons between CO2 and hydrogen. So hydrogen is in fact less viscous. Reservoir conditions, typical reservoir conditions, is less viscous than CO2. It's much less dense than CO2, which creates its own challenges from a storage perspective. From a modeling point of view, there are less data available for capillary pressure functions and relative permeability functions and capillary pressure curves for hydrogen. Still emerging work on that. CO2 is much more soluble than hydrogen. In fact, going around some comparative calculations that showed that the impact of hydrogen dissolution in the aqueous phase was almost negligible. As far as the displacement processes were concerned, we'll come back to that in a second. Diffusion coefficient for hydrogen is greater than for CO2. In terms of chemical reactions with CO2, as I mentioned before, we've got mineral precipitation and dissolution reactions to consider, and so we need to have the CO2 and other parts of the carbonate system modeled in our compositional simulations. Although the hydrogen has got a very low solubility, we can still get methane and hydrogen sulfide formation, and so there may be some, we've not started doing that yet, but there may be some need to model more sparing hydrogen solubility in the aqueous phase as well. So here's a model that was built to simulate this system. So we'll have an aquifer, we'll have an injection of CO2 first of all as a cushion gas, followed by the hydrogen, which is the main working gas to be stored. It's a fairly simple cross-sectional model with a fairly high degree of heterogeneity, Dijkstra-Parsons coefficient of 0.6, and a correlation length of 1 meter in the X and Z directions. So you can see it there, and the injection, sorry, the simulation is divided into 3 stages. First one is 0.15 pore volume of CO2 injection, followed by half that volume, 0.075 pore volume of hydrogen injection, and then production. We say hydrogen, we hope it's going to be predominantly hydrogen production, and the volume being produced there is 0.075 of a pore volume. So we're going to show you a couple of plots like this. Let me just take you through this. On the top left here, we have a base case with, so we've got capillary pressure, and there's a trapping effect due to the capillary pressure. We have at the end of the CO2 injection stage, the gas saturation here, the end of the hydrogen injection stage, and then, so we've got an injection well at the top, and then the same well is used for production, and this is the end of the production stage. So this is the gas saturations at these times. And then here on the right-hand side, we have the mole fraction of CO2, I beg your pardon, of hydrogen in the system. And you can see that we don't have a gravity stable situation here. It's slightly viscous unstable, a slightly stronger propagation of the hydrogen, and due to higher permeabilities here. You can see little spots, areas here where the hydrogen hasn't penetrated. Now these have been saturated with gas. There is CO2 in there, but the hydrogen has not been able to enter. We then, Gang then repeated these calculations, but this time, so in the top calculations, the CO2 is not soluble in water. In the bottom ones, the CO2 is soluble in water. The first thing he identified was actually you would need to increase the volume of CO2 injected to maintain the same total gas volume in the system, because we now have loss of CO2 from the gaseous phase to the aqueous phase. We also see greater degree of mixing of CO2 and hydrogens. We have a wider mixing zone, but now largely clearing out these little blue zones out here. So the hydrogen is now displacing out that CO2. The final picture looks relatively simple and similar in terms of the amount of hydrogen left in the system at the end of the production. But the interesting point here is to look and see what happens with the CO2. So here we're plotting for those same 3 periods, end of CO2 injection, end of hydrogen injection, end of production, the CO2 concentration in the aqueous phase. And it's going up to a mole fraction of just a little above 0.02. And you can see that this entire zone is, any water here has been contacted by CO2 and is pretty much fully saturated. When we inject the hydrogen is not only displacing the gas phase CO2, the CO2 that had dissolved in the water here repartitions back into the gaseous phase and is displaced away, meaning that at the end of the hydrogen injection period, there's no CO2 either in the gaseous phase or dissolved in the water close to the wellbore. And so this CO2 dissolution has a retardation effect on the CO2. It slows down the propagation of the CO2, helpfully back towards the production well. So it's going to delay the CO2 flow into the production well. And we can see here, plotted against time, we have our CO2 injection very quickly getting up to saturation, the brine being fully saturated with CO2. At this point here, the hydrogen is injected, and we can see that almost all, in fact, all of the CO2 is being stripped out of this one representative grid block, which is up here at the top of the model. What's the impact on the hydrogen purity? Well, we can see that with no solubility of CO2, the hydrogen purity decreases more quickly than when the CO2 is soluble. So we can see that a retardation effect that the CO2 dissolving in the aqueous phase has, slowing down the return of the CO2 into the production well. Now, actually, the big picture here is that we've only recovered 3% of the pore volume before the purity starts to drop. So that tells us that, as well as interesting physics going on here, we need to work quite significantly to increase the volume of the cushion gas, and perhaps have hydrogen as part of perhaps the second half of the cushion gas needs to be hydrogen to prevent that early drop off in purity. We've got two values of purity here. This is the value of purity that would be required for fuel cells. Obviously, it's way too ambitious to be injecting hydrogen into a subsurface reservoir and then use it for fuel cells. We'll never get that level of purity in economic numbers. But for just general introduction into a gas network, for example, 98% purity is quoted. And we're seeing that with solubility of CO2, we're actually getting increased amounts of hydrogen being recovered before the purity threshold is reached.
Dr. Mackay, could you wrap up in about 2 minutes?
Sure, will do. Thank you, Andrew. So here we have similar calculations performed at a 10 times lower velocity, and the main point here is we now have a gravity stable system, so we've got a much more level front going down the way here. You can see quite clearly the additional spreading that has taken place. And the impact here, interestingly enough, is that the effect of the CO2 solubility is actually slightly negative. It's just on account of the fact that actually this is a more efficient process for the hydrogen in the first place, and therefore the CO2 solubility has less of an effect. So it's more in a heterogeneous system that's unstable that this solubility of CO2 is beneficial. So during injection of CO2, the dissolution of CO2 into the aqueous phase reduces the volume of the cushion gas, and so that needs to be taken into account. And in a non-gravity dominated case, there's mixing of hydrogen into the CO2 cushion gas, but that during the production period, any previously bypassed CO2 contacts the undersaturated water, dissolving in it. That retards the progress of the CO2 towards the production well, and slightly gives us a higher purity of hydrogen for longer. But the stripping process does increase the mixing zone between the hydrogen and the CO2, and in a gravity stable case, we can actually end up with a slightly lower recovery of pure hydrogen as a consequence. So I want to finish off just by saying that compositional effects should be modeled for both CO2 and hydrogen storage, or we may lose some important physics that may have impact on our processes. Particularly, we've shown an example here of halite deposition during CO2 injection, can only be modeled with compositional simulation, and also looking at the purity of hydrogen production. There are methods for optimizing, for preventing the halite problem, or by removing the halite with wash water, or by using a pre-flush. But caution has to be you have to think about it quite carefully because of the potential for re-imbibition of saline water into the CO2 saturated zones. And finally, hydrogen storage and recovery and prediction of the purity of the hydrogen needs to take into account the balance of capillary and gravitational and viscous forces. And so careful design of the cushion gas is therefore required. With that, I'd like to thank Energy Simulation and CMG again for providing the software, the sponsors that you can see here, and our collaborators at DTU, at UFPE, and at University of Bergen. And thank you for your attention.
Okay, thank you, Dr. Mackay. Since we are running out of time here, there are quite a few interesting comments and questions. Please go into the Q&A and type in your answers, and so the audience could view from the answer tab.